On May 8th of 2008, 911 operators would get a phone call that a woman named Sharon Cause had been fatally shot in an attempted home invasion in her home after returning from a date night with her husband, Thomas Randolph. When police arrived at the scene, Thomas would explain that the couple decided to skip the movies and instead decided to stay in to have sex. Thomas would then enter the house to discover Sharon's lifeless body on the ground. Thomas immediately went for his gun and began to shoot the intruder inside his home, who, according to Thomas, was attempting to rob their house before being interrupted by Sharon. After hearing Thomas's version of events, investigators would become suspicious and they would take a closer look into Thomas. Investigators would figure out that the identity of the home invader was Michael Miller, a handyman that Thomas had previously hired. During the investigation, investigators would discover that Sharon was not Thomas's first deceased wife. As it would turn out, whenever Thomas got married, death would shortly follow. Catherine Thomas was Thomas Randolph's first wife. The couple would get married in 1975 when Catherine was 18 and Thomas was 26. The couple would stay together 8 years, living in Utah, until divorcing in 1983. Thomas would move on to Becky Galt, who he would marry the very same day his divorce from Catherine Thomas was finalized in 1983. Tragically, Becky would die 3 years into the couple's marriage. Thomas would be charged in Becky's death after investigators found that Randolph used to sing about ending Becky's life. And in 1986, Randolph would go on trial for the murder of Becky Galt. Randolph would testify at Becky's trial that Becky unalived herself by shooting herself in the head, and that she had even attempted to before. During Becky's trial, the prosecution would call Eric Tarantino to the stand to testify that Randolph had hired him to kill Becky. Thomas, however, did not realize that Eric was an undercover cop. Then Eric expressed that he feared that then he would be killed himself. Eric would then state that until the day they find him dead in a cell or they stick a needle in him, I will sleep with the gun at my side. The judge would rule Becky's death a suicide, and Thomas would be acquitted of all charges. Thomas would also receive a $500,000 life insurance payout from Becky's death. Randolph would meet Gaina Allman, and the couple would wed. Gaina was one of the lucky ones. Her marriage to Thomas ended in divorce, but her marriage to him was far from easy. Frances Thomas would become Thomas Randolph's fourth wife and would die in 2004 in a hospital following what was said to be a complication from a botched heart surgery. Frances's daughter Rachel believes that due to the fact that she was not allowed to see her mother while she was sick and that Randolph was the last person to see her mother alive, that he somehow was involved with her death. Thomas would receive a settlement from the hospital along with a payout from a life insurance policy that he had taken out on Frances. Not much is known about Randolph's fifth wife, Leona Stapleton. Randolph would tell friends and family that she died of cancer. Randolph's final wife was Sharon Cause. Thomas would then be arrested for the murder of Sharon Cause despite his pleas that it was a robbery gone wrong. Thomas would state his innocence, claiming that any of the accusations that he had anything to do with any of his wife's deaths as total nonsense. He's quoted saying, "I'm addicted to love. I'm a true romantic, but that does not make me a killer." At Sharon's trial, the prosecution accused Thomas of plotting a plan to have Sharon killed by his friend Michael in a fake home invasion in order to gain the $300,000 life insurance policy that Sharon had. Randolph would then testify at Sharon's trial, explaining his version of what happened the night of Sharon's death. Thomas would state that fidelity was never his strong suit, and that even though his wives knew about his cheating, they were okay with it. Thomas would tell police that Sharon was happy despite the fact that he was unfaithful to her, and that he also described Sharon as his forever person. During the trial, the prosecution would call Thomas's only two surviving wives to the stand. Catherine Thomas, his first wife, testified that Thomas threatened to kill her when they were together. Catherine would go on to describe Thomas as controlling, manipulative, and psychologically abusive. She testified about the time that Thomas threw a bowl of oatmeal at the wall because it did not have any sugar in it. She believes that Thomas did try to have her killed by a hitman, but the plan was unsuccessful. After her and Thomas divorced, she remarried and moved several states away to distance herself from Thomas. Gaina Allman, his third wife, testified that she had a feeling that Thomas tried to kill her, but couldn't convince a hitman to do it. She recalled a scary moment when Thomas was cleaning his gun in the kitchen in front of her and the gun went off. Luckily, the bullet missed Gaina, but it spooked her enough to believe that it was a threat to her life and left the marriage shortly after. The prosecution would bring Glenn Morrison to the stand. Glenn would testify that he was asked by Thomas to end Francis's life and stage the crime scene as a robbery. Glenn declined out of the fear that Randolph would then turn on him afterwards. The prosecution stated that the forensic science was the main focus in this case, and that something about the crime scene just seemed off, and that also, given Thomas's background and his past, he was the first suspect. The prosecution also pointed out that Thomas had many holes in his story. One of them was that he couldn't remember the exact moment that he identified the intruder. Another would be when Thomas would state that Michael was shot in the hallway, when it was clear by the evidence that Michael was shot in the garage. The court was also told about the trial of Becky Gout. Thomas does have a son and a daughter. The son has not spoken publicly about the situation, but his daughter, Krista Randolph, has, and she has stated that she believes that her father is innocent. She says that sure, he could be a not good person sometimes, but to be a killer, that's just not the person that she knows, the person that she grew up with. And she states that he thinks that the police have set him up. The jury would find Thomas Randolph guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder in the deaths of Sharon Cause and Michael Miller, and he was sentenced to death. The Nevada Supreme Court would eventually overturn Thomas's conviction. The Supreme Court ruled that the jury should have never heard about Becky Gout's death. They deemed that the similarities that the prosecution pointed out were prejudicial. Thomas would then be tried again for the death of Sharon Cause. The defense would state that the deaths of Sharon and Michael were caused by a home invasion gone wrong, orchestrated by Michael, who killed Sharon. The defense is quoted saying, "Here's the deal, ladies and gentlemen. This case is really about perspective." The prosecution was no longer seeking the death penalty in the retrial due to Thomas Randolph's age. The DA states that where Thomas states that he shot Michael does not match where the majority of the bullet cases were found. The DA stated that when the defendant tells a story, he's a hero. However, the evidence will show you that the defendant's story does not add up. The prosecution stated that Sharon and Thomas's relationship was rocky. The DA would state that Sharon's friends and family were growing concerned over the couple's relationship. There was even a friend that warned her that Thomas might kill her. The defense would tell the court that Thomas had been out of the house for many hours the night of the shooting, and due to the fact that Michael had done some odd jobs frequently around the house, that he would know where the guns, where the cash, and where the jewelry would be inside the house. When Michael was found, he had 2 women's rings inside of his pocket, along with 2 bags of jewelry that was found near him. Thomas would have received more than $360,000 worth of life insurance payouts from Sharon's death. The DA suggested that Thomas promised Michael that they would split the life insurance policy, but then Thomas changed his mind and decided to murder Michael instead. Colleen Byer, who was Sharon's daughter, would testify. Colleen would state that her mother expressed to her that Randolph was discussing getting a divorce mere hours before her death. Colleen would provide the prosecution with voicemails that Randolph left for her after the death of her mother. In said voicemails, Randolph would grow increasingly agitated over the ownership of his wife's home. Colleen testified that after hearing about her mother's death, she would call Thomas and ask, "What did you do to my mother?" Colleen said, he replied, "Michael shot and killed her," and then he hung up. This time, the jury would find Thomas guilty of 2 counts of murder and 1 count in conspiracy to commit murder, and this time, instead of being sentenced to death, he was sentenced to 60 years in prison. But due to the fact that he is already 69 years old, it is more than likely that Thomas Randolph will die behind bars. That is the end of today's video. If you liked today's video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and until next time, be safe, Earthlings. Peace out.